If you get to work and you find it's really hard to do your job with imagination, do not worry. Imagination is still really new. Dreaming is more than 100 million years old, but being able to imagine things on purpose began only like 70,000 years ago, and even then the reviews were mixed. Plato thought that imagination was kind of suspicious, and the Bible does sort of suggest that it is evil. I read in the heist issue of Businessweek about a certain kind of imagination, creative thieves. Their recent hauls include 200,000 Cadbury cream eggs, $37,000 worth of cadaver parts, 1,240 cases of crab, a 4-meter-long whale skull, and 1 catalytic converter from the Oscar Mayer Wienermobile. How are you supposed to bring imagination to work, and how do you protect it from the pressures of the marketplace? We are going to try to imagine it together tonight. It's the Businessweek Show. Welcome to the Businessweek Show. Tonight, imagination. There are some wonderful people who do the same thing over and over again, and that can be interesting or imaginative. This guest is not one of them. Theaster Gates is interested in cities, space, land, planning, preservation, place, pragmatism, value, desire, development, capital, collecting, blackness, agency, and the art world itself. And that is a very long way of saying that this sculptor and performance artist and painter and scholar is one of the most imaginative people working today. Theaster Gates, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
You have this beautiful phrase that I think of as a kind of metaphor for imagination. You talk about the possibility of life within things. How do you find that life?
Well, it's interesting. So often the life is right up under our noses. And what I've learned from Shintoism is that there's a power. There's power, there's life within things. Wood, trees, water, a rock, right? If you respect that life, maybe it means that you have to work to care and to protect and preserve that life. I feel like there are moments, like with the Stony Island Arts Bank or other projects that I've done, where when it's dead, it's a reminder of the failures of culture to invest in a thing. But when it's alive, it's like a testament to what's possible when collective people believe in the power of regeneration.
The work that you do on the south side of Chicago has been to find, I think, the meat on the bones, that have transformed spaces that were underinvested into spaces for artists to live and artists to show, and places to watch movies and places to listen to music and places to show collections. Did you find that your imagination was listened to and respected by others? Did people disbelieve that you could remake these spaces this way?
Well, let's look at this over a course of years. When I moved to my neighborhood in 2006, to the Grand Crossing neighborhood, things were interesting. It was a normal neighborhood adjacent to the University of Chicago where I had just taken a job. In 2008, the market crashed.
Yep.
And the real estate values and the kind of speculators that existed on the South Side, they were no longer interested in the speculative land. I slowly started trying to figure out, if no one else is going to buy and protect these buildings and make sure that people on the South Side have opportunity, and in my case, that culture continues to live, is there something that I could do to try to acquire some of these buildings on my block? So one at a time, with my mom's help, with friends' help, with my own sweat, we would acquire the building next to the building that we own and then renovate them best we could. And until we found ourselves owning, over the last decade, a lot of buildings.
Have they had to make a new kind of language for, you're a developer, you're an urban planner, you're an artist, are you inventing your own words so that you can explain what you've done and what you are trying to do?
Definitely. I'm definitely always both inventing words and trying to resist certain labels. But there were times where I had real translation issues. So I would go to the Department of Planning, City of Chicago, and I would walk in and I would say, I'm an artist. And I would go to my alderman and I would say, oh, I'm a local artist in your neighborhood. And that did not get me the traction that I wanted. So I had to like put on my shirt and tie, change my language a little bit and say, hey, I'm a developer. I've invested $10 million in this neighborhood. I'm interested in doing another $100 million of investment in this neighborhood, and I'd like the attention of my alderman and the commissioner of planning.
I don't think imagination has to be generative or productive to be worth something. But when I think about your work, and I think about the cafe, and I think about your mill, you created like actual jobs.
Yeah.
I think that falls under the rubric of like economic development. Can economic development be something that's imaginative instead of like destructive?
Yeah, dear friends of mine talk about, instead of talking about money, they talk about energy. What can I do to create varying kinds of good energy? And most of the time I start with, what do I want? And I want to be able to get a good cup of tea in the morning. I want to be able to hear great live music. I want to see amazing films. I want my friends who make films to feel supported in the production of their films. I want to listen to house music and I want to jack all night. I just locked in to my neighborhood and I'm like, oh, those things that I would normally try to find in another place, why don't I bring them here? I'm going to build the amenity. And if I build it for myself, it means 500 people, 1,000, 5,000 people could also benefit. And it also means that the model for neighborhood transformation, economic development, if you will, that model is playing itself out in real time. Then, and this is where I feel now as my hair whitens, that there's a way in which the work that's been accumulating, there are now other people who can grab the baton and do bigger, greater works.
Without at all taking away from the beautiful energy that you're describing, there is something that a little voice in my head that scares me about what you're describing, because it reminds me of a very old lineage. Neighborhoods without resources, artists move in because the rents are affordable. Then developers come in because now the neighborhoods are a little bit cooler. Then rents go up, they're gentrified. What can you do, and what have you done on the South Side to make sure that the work that you're doing and the imagination that you're bringing is going to include your neighbors and not, eventually, I guess, like exile them?
Yeah. Well, right now, I feel like I'm in the middle of living this playbook that I'll eventually share with others. But a big part of it was the acquisition of land and then protecting that land so that it was always available for mission-based activity. Wildlife happens, and change happens in cities that will have 500,000 square feet worth of residential space, 2 million square feet of commercial and cultural space.
2 million?
That will protect, when this thing is over.
Theaster, if you're talking on a scale of millions of square feet, I feel so sure that there have to be capitalists listening to this who are going to be calling you up and trying to say, these nonprofit investments you're making, you're a fool. You should be making money from this. Do you get calls like that?
Well, I would go back to this issue of like the life and things. I think that one way of reading death is when a neighborhood has been underinvested in. Another way of reading death is when the fabric of the neighborhood has been forgotten and it's been replaced with gross reinvestment and redevelopment. The death of cities is not just the problem of gangs and violence. The death of cities is also when we become monotonous versions of ourselves.
Yeah.
And so I think that wealth has to develop more sophisticated tools for measuring health and life, and be willing to invest in ways that are more about what humans need than just about the bottom line.
I really like connecting the life of things with the with the death of imagination.
Yeah, yeah.
How have you learned to like protect your imagination, the life of your imagination, and to keep it going? Imagination dies too, creativity. How do you protect it and give it life?
You know, when I was young and my dad would make me paint the baseboards of apartments that he was renting, and it was time to turn the apartments over because someone had moved out. And he was like, whatever you do, don't get paint on my floor. And so I learned to tape, and I learned to use a paintbrush so that I could fan white paint and make sure that I wouldn't mess up his walnut floors. In a way, my dad was inventing creativity in me, inventing a deeper imagination by telling me to paint the baseboards. The way that I protect my imagination now is by continuing to work. That everything I do, I'm trying to find good solutions for complicated problems.
What are you going to do next? I mean, what are your dreams, and what does your imagination tell you about what the future holds, and why, you know, what's stopping you from doing it right now?
Well, maybe this goes back to Buddhism. I'm thinking about how to, you know, it's been about 15, 20 years of building, and I feel like right now I'm preoccupied with how to give it all away, how to let go of this tight hold that I've had on development and imagine it as like a kind of long-term durational performance. That I've been involved in a 15 to 20 year performance of neighborhood transformation. And at the end of the performance, the audience gets all the props back. So I'm learning a lot from people who are actively trying to say, I've been given too much, I've figured out some things, and I made a lot.
Goodbye.
Yeah.
Do you have an instinct about how you're going to start? How you're going to start saying goodbye?
With gifts.
Do you know yet who you want to give your first gifts to?
Artists.
Are there any journalists you know you'd like to give some of your records to? No, I'm just kidding.
Maybe I'll keep the records. We can swap records. We can swap records.
Exchange.
Yeah.
That was a pure joke. Theaster Gates, it's a pleasure for me to listen to you.
It's my pleasure.
Thanks for being here. I really enjoyed that. Up until just a few decades ago, the systems of American art had practically no room for women. Museums, galleries, auctions, schools, and mass media gave the distinct impression that men had a monopoly on imagination itself. The guest who's sitting with me at this table played a key role in changing that. Judy Chicago's painting, sculpture, photography, needlework, much more, has helped alter the shape of art itself. And at 84, she is getting her first major museum survey here in New York at a new museum show that's just brimming with color and generosity and imagination. It's really nice to have her here. Judy Chicago.
Thank you.
The art world has become a big business in the way that it wasn't when you were starting. So I'm curious to ask, like, what have you learned about big business and about how big business works and how it looks that you couldn't have foreseen back then?
Well, first of all, you know, I've been asked a lot about, oh, well, aren't you upset that this recognition has been so delayed and blah, blah, blah. Actually, I'm not. You know why? Because I had 5 decades of working in my studio without ever thinking about the market. So you have to really understand how outside of that I've been, because I had my own vision of what art can be, should be. I believe art is an act of generosity, and that I feel really bad for young artists because, you know, they get swallowed up, spit out like stocks on the stock exchange. But, you know, you can stand up to that. You don't have to do it.
Your work is willing to imagine something that, you know, I have a hard time with, which is, you know, not just the death of the world, which is something the art does deal with, but your own death. I was really moved by, I think it's called a mortality relief It's this
Oh, yeah.
bronze piece
Yeah, yeah.
in the exhibit, and it looks almost like a death mask in advance. But you clearly are able to imagine your end. What do you think about when you think about it?
I wanted to be able to face the end of my life with grace and courage, because it really isn't good to have an adversarial relationship to aging. I started out exploring, I start with research, so I started looking at attitudes towards death going back in time. And of course, discovered that, we are an aberration in terms of the way we shroud death, hide death, try to have battles with death. When they write about cancer, after a battle, give me a break. Nature's going to win.
Hearing you talk now reminds me that, I have a relatively romantic idea of imagination, especially when I'm sitting with a wonderful artist who makes work that I admire. I guess I'm tempted to think of imagination as this very beautiful thing that could take you to very beautiful places. But you were also willing to imagine horror and grotesquerie. And I think that maybe people are uncomfortable doing that.
There are a lot of people who are concerned about what's happening in our world, and they need to be encouraged to look at it, to think about it. We are encouraging people to participate in this digital quilt that I created with Dementi, the Web3 company, and Naja, one of the founders of Pussy Riot. And so there are a series of questions that I believe we need to answer, like, if patriarchy were dismantled, would women and men be equal? Would men have permission to be gentle and vulnerable? Would women have permission to be strong? Would there be equal parenting? Would the earth be protected? I think there are questions that we need to come together and answer. We are so polarized now. But if we don't answer those questions, we're going to drive the world to destruction.
Judy, what you're describing when you talk about this work is the ability that an artist has to use her skills and to use her imagination to pose these difficult questions to people and make them think about it. But it's like, Judy, I'm no artist. I don't have these skills. Is there something that non-artists can take from you where, like you, they can use what they're good at to make other people think in new ways? But for most of us, we're not able to paint and draw the way you can.
Of course, what we're looking at now is the pushback and the effort to push back all the gains that started in the 70s. It will take millions of people putting down their phones and going in the streets. I don't understand why there were not millions of people in the street after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. Not protests, because just a protest doesn't work anymore. What is required is the same thing that propelled the social change movements of the 70s, which has to do with organization, all the things that aren't fun to do. Developing leadership, developing organizations that can take the protest and turn it into actual civil change. I want to tell you something. It's worth it to feel like you've made a contribution, to have the satisfaction of that. I don't care what the New York Times said over the course of my career.
I live right by the Brooklyn Museum, where the dinner party is the heart of this beautiful collection of feminist art. The center is named for a member of the family behind Purdue Pharma and OxyContin. Apart from just what everyone else says about philanthropy and money and naming, I'm just curious how you feel about that.
First of all, we're going to answer you with a counter question. Elizabeth Sackler's establishment of the Center for Feminist Art has allowed dozens of unknown women and feminist artists to be exhibited. Does she get any points for that? Or does her name disqualify everything she has done. Patronage is complicated, and so is history. It's like when everybody wanted to just knock down the Confederates' statues and sort of erase our past. I'm like, what if we let Black people, African Americans, come and write their stories on the statues so that we would see multiple points of view simultaneously, the point of view of the oppressor, the point of view of the oppressed.
I want to end, Judy, with the future. I'm curious if you imagine, you know, what art will look like. We're living in this strange time of artificial intelligence. You know, I'm wondering if you imagine that AI will demand room for itself in the art world. I'm wondering if the opposite will happen and the infinite possibilities of computerized art will teach us to embrace craft and imperfection.
My answer is going to be really short.
Okay.
Many, many years ago, Bruce Nauman and I had a conversation about, we were in our 40s, about how art schools were getting rid of drawing. And we agreed that when you're a young artist full of bravado and energy, you can go a long way in your career. But when you get into your 40s and your ideas get more complex, if you can't draw, you come to a standstill. And I am somebody who believes in the hand. And I believe in the connection between the hand and the heart. And that's my answer.
Well, your hand and your heart and your imagination have changed other people's hearts and their imaginations. I'm really glad you've been here to talk to me about it. Really, really enjoyed it. Judy Chicago.
Thank you very much.
So
You're
much.
very smart.
Imagine this. You've got an imagination, you've got a job to do, but you're not sure how to bring one to the other. These two guests tonight have used their imagination successfully in completely different ways. One of them has used his to transform his neighborhood inside Chicago. The other one has used hers to transform herself into a Chicago and to transform art history itself. Maybe you use your imagination inside the market. Maybe you use it despite the market. Either way, you can steal the tools of these two artists. Patience, practice, collaboration, voice, and fight. Thank you so much for watching. We will see you next time.
When all else fails, one must scream. Well, as we look at what's happened to our world, it makes me angry that more people aren't screaming.
There have been times in the workplace when I've said that things were good when they weren't good. Sometimes because I was trying to maintain staff morale. Sometimes I was trying to be optimistic, like this is gonna be good, even though it's not good today. And then there have been other times where I've known that the person I was talking to had such a fragile ego, and you gotta be sensitive when you work with other creatives.
That's enough already, guys. Now, come on. Come on.
Oh, wait, the mic, the mic.
I know.
This story did come around as something that's a bit different. There is a dark side to it.
It's hard to even talk to people about these chemicals and tell them, look, there's a chemical that's in you that's not found anywhere in nature.
This is the shadow fleet. To actually see clandestine behaviour, that makes you think, well, what else is going on?